an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Welcome to this week's edition of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. With me today is Sabrina Nanji, the publisher of Queen's Park Observer, John Wright from Maru Public Opinion. Dave Trafford, our normal host, is off today, so I'm substituting. I'm Keith Leslie. You see me sometimes on CHCH-TV as a political commentator. And of course, Ontario politics is the focus today. And I guess the number one issue this week, Sabrina, has been, where's Dougie? Where's Premier Ford? I mean, there was an awful lot going on at the legislature, and the Premier not only didn't show up at all in question period this week, he missed, events like the Order of Ontario, and even blew off the first meeting with the new Mayor of Ottawa, Mark Suttcliffe. It seems kind of strange for him to be so absent, and the Premier's office not offering up any explanations, nor saying whether or not he attended a fundraiser this week. Like, was his one public event a fundraiser? We don't even know that. Any idea what's going on with the Premier?
The short answer is no, but it's not for a lack of trying. You're right. The Premier, his office doesn't share itinerary, like even what we're used to getting from premiers past. So I'm kind of used to, chasing down Doug Ford, finding out where he's been through his social media. And even that has been very quiet. Last week he was actually out, glad handing. He went to police association gala, that type of thing. This week it's crickets. He wasn't in question period. He's not there quite often. And actually the PCs changed the rules when it comes to premier's attendance, so they're not so penalized for skipping out on question period. And he did bail on the Order of Ontario awards ceremony. I mean, he was even on the media advisory along with Lieutenant Governor Elizabeth Dowdeswell on that. So that was kind of surprised that he wasn't there. And yeah, he skipped out on that meeting with Mark Suttcliffe, Ottawa mayor, who has had some tough words for him when it comes to strong mayors and has vowed not to use those powers. So the big question, and I did ask Ford's office where he is, did not receive a response whatsoever, not even an acknowledgement of my question. And there was, a rumor that he did attend a big ticket fundraiser for about $1,000 per person that would go towards the PC party, obviously, in Brampton. Now, the theory on that, it's not confirmed whether he was there, but the theory is that the Conservatives, by law, they need to disclose certain information about fundraising events, where they're being held, how much tickets are, that type of thing. And the PCs tend to list the names of usually ministers that are hosting these fundraising events. And every time they don't put a name on the invite, it's kind of an assumption that Doug Ford will be there. So where's Doug is the big question. He's not around. The House is winding down. There's just 2 more sitting weeks left. So, and he has had a lot of controversy to deal with. So I'm not surprised that he may not want to be front and center these days with what's happening in healthcare, rocky education negotiations, still ongoing with teachers. So I hope we'll see him in the next few days because he's got a lot of questions that need to be answered.
John, what's the thinking here? Is the Premier just trying to avoid? I mean, the government is getting under attack from all sides here. The situation in the hospitals is getting worse by the day, and the horror stories, of moms with their kids. I mean, there was the kid in Hamilton who was burned and couldn't get into the McMaster Children's Unit. He had to go to London 90 minutes away after a burn in a fire. I mean, these kind of stories, the opening up the Greenbelt, the Housing Act, again, being attacked from everyone from architects to municipalities who are losing hundreds of millions of dollars. Is this the Premier just, trying to avoid all of this and let these last 2 weeks of the session ride out? Normally, Doug Ford will stand up at least once a week in the House and take some questions on the chin for this kind of stuff. What's the thinking behind this? And we've discussed before about how they like to avoid, he likes to keep his ministers out of the media limelight as much as he can too. But for him to just really go to ground for the entire week is very unusual.
Yeah, it is. In fact, we probably haven't seen that since a year ago, March, when he, was making that course correction. Remember where he was at his mom's place and had COVID, was sheltering from COVID, and we didn't hear from him for a period of time. It is unusual for him to do that, but maybe it is a personal circumstance. I think the greater issue that we have is not so much him, but the Minister of Health is missing in action completely. I mean, this is one of the most incredibly pressured times for patients and people who are in the system, children, so many vexing questions. And whether it is the minister herself or whether it's the premier's office yanking her back and making sure that she doesn't say anything, it's remarkable where we had a health minister in our living rooms almost every day during COVID. And even when that sort of subsided, Christine Elliott was out front all the time. You talk about a word called, 2 words called public health. The key word in there is public, not just health. And I'm surprised that that's the case, that we don't have a discussion in this province where it's left to speculate that the premier is ducking these important questions on healthcare and some other things when they've got capable ministers who are saying absolutely nothing. Now, I mean, Stephen Lecce would I think, say something at the drop of a hat. I mean, there's nothing that stopped him ever from saying anything or going on for any length of time. The real issue is we have some issues dealing with development around the province. We have issues dealing with strong mayor policies and particularly healthcare. And I don't see the ministers really responding much to it whatsoever.
Well, I mean, when we keep hearing these horror stories in the legislature, of children waiting 40 hours in the emergency department to get seen, really sick children. I mean, and the room's full of them waiting this kind of time. I mean, our health minister, Ms. Jones, stood in the legislature and said, well, it's deeply disturbing. These are not new issues. We inherited a system that was basically, needed a huge investment. In other words, even though we're now a second-term government, this clearly is not our fault. I mean, come on. That's really she has been, and the government has been very tone deaf on this whole crisis in hospitals, and they're just refusing to acknowledge reality. I mean, we had, I think it was 5 healthcare unions on Thursday in the news studio. And yes, of course, you're going to say the unions are pointing, but it's the nurses, it's everybody who's working in the system. And of course, all the way through the system is saying it's beyond in crisis. It's crumbling and people are having to wait ridiculously long times. People in need of life-saving heart surgery are being told it's just postponed indefinitely. The system needs a lot more than, well, we inherited a mess and we're trying to get it better. What are you doing specifically? I know you've put a lot of money into the budget, but as we mentioned, there was nothing new in the fall economic statement, which was the new mini budget, which really was an opportunity 6 months after the budget to show you're taking this extremely seriously, that you're doing something more than what we've already heard of 6 months ago. So Ms. Jones, I don't know, Sabrina, do you think she should be having a little bit more to say than, it's just not our fault?
Yeah, I mean, the line that we hear constantly from this government that we inherited a mess, it's not going to fly anymore. This is their second term. They need to start taking responsibility, for us getting to this point. And to John's point about, the premier's office maybe controlling the ministers and having a bit of a heavy hand in that sense. I mean, Minister Jones's new director of communications came from Ford's office, Alexandra Adamo. She just moved over there. So certainly, there is a lot of tight control happening here. But at the same time, I mean, Minister Jones is actually speaking later today in Ottawa. She'll have an announcement and face some questions. But when we do get her and we do get to ask her questions, the answers are, it goes beyond talking points. I mean, she pushes back and she's a little bit combative. And, for a health minister that is, speaking to families that are having their kids, wait in hallways in the hospital, she could work on her bedside manner. Absolutely. Acknowledge, what families are dealing with and commiserate. It's not so much about blaming at this point, but, or even taking responsibility, but what are you going to do about it? She has pushed back on what those healthcare unions were talking about this week, that there is going to be an undermining, that the government is undermining, public healthcare in a push for privatization. But at the same time, if you're a parent, you're looking for kids Tylenol, your kid needs a hospital bed or it needs hospital care, you're very stressed out. You're very on edge now. And so I do think, Jones could probably work on her media training, as we like to call it, a little bit, because I don't think she's going to get shuffled out of that role. But in terms of how things are going so far, I think that she is kind of creating more of at least a PR problem for these guys at this point.
John, jump in. You look
well. You know what? There's on a few points, Serena, you're absolutely right. They've been in power for 5 years. They've had all kinds of things that they've touted about investing in the system. I'm not an expert in the system, but I can tell you 2 anecdotes. One is talking to somebody in another part of the province who's in a long-term care facility. And two things are happening. Number one, those people who are being transferred from the hospitals are actually bumping other people who are in the local area out of the long-term care homes. I mean, there's only so many beds. You start moving people into other areas, notwithstanding the fact that their families are now left behind, and there's a charter challenge that may be coming up that takes years and years and years. But the reality is it's bumping beds. We don't have enough of them, and it's just going to get worse. The second thing was that talking with the head of that long-term care facility, they can't get staff. And the reason they can't get staff is because the staff they had is now making $110 an hour from an agency that's supposed to fill the spots that they've actually taken out. And I mean, they're held to a 2% wage increase by the legislation that's been in place. And we've heard this from the nurses on the other side who have now moved out of the hospital sector in order to be in those private agencies so they can be subbed back to make more money. You know what she's doing? She's actively trying to recruit from the Philippines right now, trying to get people to come in and guarantee that they will have, believe it or not, they will have billets in the area so that residents themselves can get the care that they need to have done. Part of public health, or probably the most important part, is public assurance. And there's clearly something going on that maybe the unions have got a hold of now and are going to try and use that as a wedge. To say that this really is the creeping element of privatization of the healthcare system. But you need the assurance of a health minister. And Keith, you and I and Sabrina can go back a long way, everywhere to Larry Grossman and Dennis Timbrell and Betty Stevenson way back in those generations, right up to George Smitherman and even the last health minister that has occupied that place. They all seem to be fighting for the healthcare system to be better for people. And Serena, I don't know how long this minister can stay in this job if all of a sudden these points of focus start pressuring her and come to bear. We haven't seen a full onslaught of the media in this, but there's enough out there that in the absence of good leadership from the other two parties, it's going to have to come from other places. And geez, I just don't know whether she would be able to survive, a few weeks of concentrated pressure on that portfolio, because I know the premier would want to back her and everything, but you can't keep out of the limelight, and you can't keep evading questions and loading it on the previous administration.
Well, Sabrina, the opposition parties do seem to be trying to use that same message as the unions, that the Conservatives are doing, what the Conservatives are known to do, which is create a crisis in healthcare and tell us that the only solution is going to be privatization, more private care. And of course, the corollary for that is, anytime you're taking profit out of the system, that money is not going to direct patient care. That's the debate. But it seems that they're absolutely, Jones again, when, talked about asked about the privatization. We know the language has been changed behind the scene, and they still will always, insist that you're never going to use your credit card, just your OHIP card. But there's going to be profit taken out of the system as the PCs reform the system to bring in private delivery. And I think one sure sign that that's going to happen is just down the street, the Chamber of Commerce in Toronto, Ontario Chamber of Commerce was hosting a conference on how can the private sector help us with our current healthcare crisis. I mean, this is something that PCs are clearly laying the agenda for, and perhaps that's why Jones is in this position, because she's very comfortable with that.
Yeah, I think that, they're not doing much to help themselves when it comes to, the fears about this. You mentioned, the language has changed. I mean, the opposition has been hammering Jones in question period about her binder notes, getting scratched out, that, we're not going to privatize, full stop. Why was that language changed? They've kind of been flirting with these phrases like we need innovation, the status quo isn't working. So it certainly seems like they're setting the groundwork for it. And obviously, our healthcare system is, partially privatized. Like I think the last time it was like around 30% is, the private sector does play a role in here. And so I think that, something needs to be done at this point. The fact that the Ford government is just being not transparent at all on this is probably where a lot of the fears are coming from. But I think at the end of the day, what's happening here, it's not a matter of just throwing money at the public system. I mean, we need to kind of look at the jobs, are they attracting people, the wages, nurses in particular have been subject to this 1% wage cap increase. And so that's why, as John mentioned, they're leaving to go to private clinics. And so I don't know, what the solution is here, but I do think because of the situation that we're in, that the public might have a bit of a more open mind into how we kind of fix this. So it does seem like it's a bit of a, potentially scary situation, at least for healthcare and public healthcare as we know it in this country. But at the same time, we do need help. And I think that's the bottom line here. And when it comes to the Ford government in particular, I think John Fraser, the Liberal interim leader, kind of said it best, is like, what's going on? Like, what's the agenda for these guys? They're kind of obsessed with municipalities and strong mayors and tinkering with that. And I'm hungry for like a legacy project here. Back in 2018, they were talking about Ontario health teams, changing the whole structure of the health system. Like, what are these guys doing right now? What do they stand for? There's like small C conservatives that are saying to me, this is an opportunity. They have this huge majority and they're not doing anything. And so I think I'm just hungry for like some big vision, especially on healthcare from these guys. And then I guess, we have to take it to the public and see how they feel about it.
Well, John, you raised the issue earlier of agency nurses. And we know hospitals are now, as you're saying, they're paying something like $110 an hour for an agency nurse. Why are these nurses not on staff? Is it just they don't necessarily prefer working for an agency? But obviously the money's better for them there, but they need better working conditions at the hospitals, better pay at the hospitals. But why are the hospitals, why do they find it economical to use agency nurses that cost twice as much as a staff nurse?
Well, they don't. I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, they're now being offered an opportunity outside of the system, and who would turn it down? Would any of us? I mean, you'd have flexible hours. You could say, no, I'm not going to do that shift. There's a whole lot of pressure that's suddenly taken off of them. They don't have to be in a hospital necessarily that's going to be clamoring for you to, make an extra shift, do this, do that, as opposed to, God, we'd love to have you and we'll pay you this to get you in the door. I mean, the other thing too with this, and I don't know, again, I'll go back to the minister herself. This is a real opportunity for this government to talk about not so much privatization, but energizing the system. You can look at this as either crisis or opportunity, but the reality is that even in my polling, if you go out and ask people over the age of 55 whether they would be willing to contribute more to the healthcare system in form of some kind of a tax themselves, like to them, in order to guarantee them that they would have some kind of thing at the end of the road for them when they need it, they say yes. I mean, they've got, 30% of them may not have the money to do that, but you can means test things. But there's a lot of people now who are scared, who are getting older, who are in their 60s, who are looking forward only 10 years from now and saying, it's not going to be there. And I don't even have enough money in my own line of credit in my house, or even if I sold my house to look after myself, we don't have enough beds. The Ford government has decided that housing is going to be its priority. And when in fact, it's all about accommodation. It's accommodation for older people. It's accommodation for people going into hospital. It's accommodation for people who, even when you're going to build these homes, when are they going to be built? And can you tell me whether or not they're going to be affordable for the same people that can't buy them now? It ain't going to happen. So the reality is that we're going to be facing a crisis. You've heard me on this show before. We are facing a crisis right now that actually is enveloping other parts of the country. I mean, BC is going through the same thing right now. We have the federal health people out on Friday morning talking about how everybody's got to make sure they've got their influenza shots. They're bringing in Tylenol. I mean, this is a situation across the country that's enveloping our healthcare systems. But this also provides an opportunity for canny and good government that can actually manage the profile to say this is an opportunity. We have to do something to make it better for people. And I don't like. There's just no there. There's no commentary about it. We hear more about swapping land and dealing with strong powers from mayors than we do about the healthcare system and trying to save lives on the ground. And I think again, this comes back maybe to the minister herself, because who else is responsible for the portfolio and who's out there speaking? If the premier's absent and she's absent, then we're all left on our own like some big life raft, and hopefully we'll get to our destination. But we're usually used to having somebody help us be a beacon.
Yes. Changing tactic, but still staying with that sort of idea of a legacy project, a legacy theme from this government, Sabrina. transit and subways and highways. And we learned this week that the Ontario line is going to cost $20 billion, not the $11 billion we thought just a few years ago. It's like something like $1 billion a kilometer. They've already awarded $15 billion in contracts to mostly foreign companies, from what I can see, for just this particular line. The NDP, of course, pointing to this and saying, all P3s, this happens with every P3, and they're building a lot of hospitals with P3s. They're building highways with P3s. Is this Ontario line nearly doubling in cost in a very short order of time a surprise? And is it a bad forecast for the future of these other P3 projects that the Tories are pinning their legacy on to a huge degree?
Yeah, and Infrastructure Minister King Asurma was actually speaking at a P3 conference this week. So no, I don't think they're going anywhere, much to the chagrin of the NDP. For me, I guess maybe I'm just too disillusioned, but no, I wasn't surprised to see these costs ballooning. I'm just waiting, for the timeline to just be extended indefinitely now. It just seems like the fate of every big transit project in the city or even in the GTA, about cost overruns, timeline overruns and that type of thing. And I think that for a lot of people, they were kind of looking at Doug Ford and saying like, look, we need this transit and we need it done. And maybe, Ford's the one who can kind of just barrel through and make it happen. But there were like holes in this from the get-go, right? Like they have not given us straight numbers on this from the beginning. There were a lot of questions about funding, a lot of their transit projects, highways, that type of thing. There are still questions over the money on that. So for me, it's not really surprising, maybe more depressing than anything else. And it kind of feels like the Ontario line and these projects are getting further and further out of reach. And, so long to the trees, because that's kind of the other story happening too, is Metrolinx having to cut down a lot of trees to get this thing built. But, the bottom line is that we need transit. Every government has tried. I have heard one theory that, at least when it comes to transit, we shouldn't be, having governments change every 4 years, because all these plans kind of, shift with every new iteration, and that things never get built. And so for me, as, someone who doesn't drive and someone who takes transit, this is just kind of very depressing, but not so surprising.
Well, like your point about previous governments, I mean, the Mike Harris Conservative government filling in what had been dug for the Eglinton Crosstown, then having to be, that sort of sums up that in a nutshell. John, is this, it's clearly not surprising, as Sabrina said, the cost is so high already, but shovels aren't in the ground yet. It hasn't even started. And as we saw with Union Station, another project in that same general vicinity, man, that went years and years over, or not only over budget, but years and years beyond schedule. This is likely to happen here. Major intersections in the city are going to be closed, scheduled for 4 years, probably going to be 6, 7, who knows? Are they biting off too much? Or is it too ambitious a project? Or is it just, as Sabrina said, the transit is desperately needed and it's going to take what it takes to get this built?
I don't know. I don't know, because we don't have a face doing a regular briefing on where they're at and why we're having these delays. So from where I'm stationed in my house today, Eglinton Avenue is about 700 meters north of me. And there's construction there still ongoing, which we've experienced for all this length of time. But I have yet to hear why the delays are happening. I don't, Sabrina, maybe you have. But on the other hand, I do recognize two other things. And that is that whenever we've had something like this, it has gone on forever. And the costs have escalated. And if you think the costs would have escalated normally, think now, because of the supply chain problems we've had cement issues where, it's increased the cost. All the materials that you would have for wood, everything to do with these construction sites, doesn't matter whether it's transit or not, the enormous cost now that it's going to have. So that's okay, but I wish I'd have somebody explaining it to me. Again, this is kind of the groundhog approach to public policy issues. It's like we just won't say anything. And I guess I've become used to it. But the other consequence of this is I don't believe that this city, in fact, is going to be able to get out of the transit issues that it's in. Everybody's saying, let's make sure that bicycles can have the route. Let's make sure that people can use public transit. man, oh man, it's not going to happen in my lifetime. I mean, I'm going to die and hopefully get to heaven and say, when will it be solved? And God's going to look at me and say, your guess is as good as mine. I mean, I don't know how we are going to have a city that operates in a place like Toronto that goes at this pace with not only the subways and rail extensions, but even the bus service and everything else in this town is not conducive to having cars eliminated. So a lot of frustration with that, just as someone who lives here and someone who's trying to get around in the city. But again, there's nobody out there talking about it with the pointer and the chart saying, this is what we have to deal with, this is what's going on, blah, blah, blah. I haven't heard that literally in years. Where's the authority who's actually supposed to be speaking on this?
Well, we might find out a little bit more this week, perhaps, Sabrina, when the report into the LRT system in Ottawa is coming out on Wednesday. I mean, that was apparently Ottawa bought an LRT system. Hamilton's about to get theirs. And Ottawa purchased one that apparently wasn't meant for, what's that? Oh, winter.
Yeah.
So other cities in southern Ontario, let alone the north, would have obvious concerns here. So it's going to be very interesting to hear this report. It's yet another thing that this provincial government has been virtually mum on. It's like that whole thing had absolutely nothing to do with them. So this report is at least going to point us to where Ottawa had some very serious issues with their LRT. Does this, again, is it going to get us information about other ones? Is it going to give this government any sense of pause on the LRT projects it has? Or is it going to be just, again, well, we can learn from these mistakes, even though Ottawa still has issues getting the LRT to run on cold days?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think if nothing else, there will potentially be some lessons learned here. Another report that I'm really looking forward to is the Auditor General's annual report, which is due out, I think in the next 2 weeks at some point. We don't have a specific date yet, but one of my former colleagues had called it the annual government phone book of fail, because it's like this huge, thousands of pages long report, just auditing everything you can think of. I do wonder if, the AG can actually look into some of these transit plans, because she's more backwards looking. It's more of an audit rather than forwards looking, which is kind of what the Budget Watchdog Financial Accountability Office does. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing, what she digs up, because that is, it's basically Christmas for anyone who wants to hold any government accountable. And so I'll be pouring through that one with a keen eye for sure.
I couldn't agree more. I always thought and wished, it was like Christmas for reporters, as you say, but I always wished as a reporter, because it's usually 8 or 10 chapters at least that are very interesting, put it out once a month. We could dine on that once a month with each one, because there's a lot gets lost in the Auditor General stories, because there's just, as you say, generally so much in there. Things that are very interesting often don't make stories. I used to, again, at a great time, it comes out in early December. So for that slow period between Christmas and New Year's, you dig into there for some nuggets that, you can absolutely find some in there. But it's a key part of the year, and it's the one time the government does get held to fiscal account really severely, because they dispute our numbers all the time, but this Auditor General has a fair degree of respect in the community. I guess that's it for us. That's this week's edition of On the Ledge. I want to thank John and Sabrina. Best wishes to Dave Trafford. He'll be back in the anchor chair next week. Thank you very much.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.